Hi, my name's Erica Winchell. I'm from Northwest Iowa is where I grew up, but I graduated from South Dakota State University with a bachelor's in architecture and then minors in construction management and military science. Um, that's a little bit about me. So I was asked to discuss some of my thoughts on the readings. And when I think about the readings, I really think of them as two separate entities that have a relationship to one another in a very sort of dynamic way, mainly in the fact that they both bring up, what, and not even they bring it up, but what does monuments mean today? Like, what do these monuments mean today? Um, in the first reading, it discusses how you don't need those exact buildings or these exact sculptures that were around during the Renaissance era and things like that to understand what they were, because we have paintings, we have history books that describe them, we have authors that describe them. So we have floor plans, things like that. And in the other reading, it talks about us tearing down, in modern days, us tearing down these monuments that reflect a certain level of I'm blanking on a word. They're inappropriate is what some people are discussing, and I'm not going to say my views on them. But were these, when these other, and granted a lot of them were in these Renaissance era that it discusses, and it talks about it briefly in the Mumford reading. But it's really important to bring up because is taking the actual object away, taking away the history, or can we preserve the history in a different way that makes it so that that object doesn't have to exist in current times in order for us to understand what it meant? So in the reading, it talks about one of the, I believe it was one of the statues that they said was actually about like the Southern heritage and things like that, and the South's fight for civil rights. And I found it interesting because I believe that there, and I'm not going to say my views, there's other ways in order for us to preserve that historical context without having that actual figure be there. Today we have encyclopedias. We have the History Channel where things are constantly being added in. And then, we have paintings, and that's something it brings up in the Mumford reading, is that we have paintings of these buildings, we have paintings of these objects, but we don't have the objects, but we still understand what they were. So I find that to be really interesting. I mean, in the Mumford reading I liked the Mumford reading a little bit more. It was more my type of reading, but the fact that it brings up the, how do we as people relate to the living and the dead? And, is that kind of what we think of architecture, is like we have to make it so that it's seen forever? Or do we make things for the living? And when we make a structure, is it the framework that's made for the living or the dead? Like, is it the intimate spaces that are created within, or is it the framework as a whole that we're hoping that can be preserved? Because a lot of the buildings that we look at, I mean, we saw Notre Dame burn down, and that building as a whole was the history. That was the whole point of it. The construction method behind that building was beyond its time. But when we look at when it burned down, it wasn't the framework, which granted was extremely old, but it was the fact that that whole thing came down. I mean, not the whole building, but we know what I'm talking about. That you can't just rearrange the spaces and it'll be okay. That history is gone. All the things up there is gone. So that's kind of the takeaway I'm taking from this, is like, if we take away the actual object, are we losing the history? And can we put that history into something else? In an architecture, is it the frame? Is it the building? Or is it its memory? Is it what it means that is, historically important? I don't know if I'm even on the right track for where the discussion is going to be going. I don't know when this is going to be played, if it's even going to be played, but that's kind of my viewpoints. So yeah, thank you for listening.